Session 3, we're talking about a historical survey of first century Christian assembly. Lesson 2, we were talking about what exactly a home fellowship looked like. And I asked the question, what was the purpose of a home fellowship? What was the purpose of the believers assembling together in the first century? And we made the case that the purpose for fellowship was for the mutual edification of the body. Using our gifts, using each believer using their spiritual gifts, coming together, using their spiritual gifts for mutual edification of the body, each one of us building up the other. And we said that that mutual edification of the body was accomplished through 4 functions. And those functions were through doctrine, through fellowship or partnership, enjoying the things that we have in common with one another, through the breaking of bread, and through prayer. Those 4 functions. And you can go through all of the New Testament and see these 4 things happening throughout the New Testament. For my next lesson, I want to focus on this one right here. This function, edifying the body through the breaking of bread. And we made the we made the point that the breaking of bread had to do with having a fellowship meal. Since we are a family, we have this idea whenever family members get together, families eat together. That's just a natural part of being a family. And once again, I want to thank Susan for all the wonderful work that she's done, especially with the food here at the conference this weekend. It's one of those things that I look forward to with this conference. In addition to the fellowship, just all the wonderful food. And just sitting together with brothers and sisters in Christ, enjoying each other's company, enjoying each other's fellowship, and having these meals together. It's just wonderful. So we said that having these fellowship meals together in the first century, we saw that the integral part of these fellowship meals was the Lord's table. And so this lesson I want to focus on that, this idea of breaking of bread together. If you go ahead and turn in your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, you can do that. I'm going to put it up here on the screen for those of you watching online. I hope you can see all this. I know it's kind of small, there's a lot in there. I tried to get it all on one slide. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 30, we have this familiar account of Paul talking about the Lord's table. And those of you who have grown up in church and go to church regularly, every time there's a communion Sunday, the pastor will read from this passage whenever they hand out the crackers and the grape juice. So let's just review this real quick. For I have received of the Lord that which I also delivered unto you, that the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and said, Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. After the same manner he also took the cup, when he had supped, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood. Let me just stop right there for a second. Do you notice that the cup didn't immediately follow the bread? The cup came after dinner. It said after he had supped, after he had eaten dinner. He passed around the bread, they ate dinner, then he passed around the cup. Take, drink ye all of it. Oh, sorry. Lost my place. This cup is the New Testament in my blood. This do ye, as oft as ye drink it, in remembrance of me. For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, you do show forth the Lord's death till he come. Wherefore, whosoever shall eat this bread and drink this cup of the Lord unworthily shall be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. Let a man examine himself, And so let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup. For he that eateth and drinketh unworthily eateth and drinketh damnation to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. For this cause many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. Now can I be honest with you? I'm always honest with you. Like I was lying to you before. Why do we say that? We always say, now let me be honest with you. And I want to say, oh, were you lying to me before? There was a time when those last two verses used to scare the life out of me. I grew up in the church. I was saved when I was 7 years old. And anytime we'd have communion in church, my parents always told me I had to wait until I was old enough to take communion. They wanted to make sure I understood it. And I understand what was going on with communion, why we do it. So they wanted me to wait. And I'm like, well, okay, how long do I have to wait? When am I going to be old enough to understand it? It's just kind of waiting for permission, I guess. I think I was 14 or 15 before I finally took communion in church. But ever since then, these words were always resonating in my mind. Examine yourself. Eat and drink unworthily. Eat and drink damnation. You've always got those words rattling around in the back of your head. And communion service in any church, communion service is always this somber, solemn event. We have to be reverent and respectful and quiet. And the organ's playing very soft at the cross. At the cross.
Oh my.
And everyone's got their heads down and their eyes closed because you're supposed to be thinking about your sin and the cross and Jesus' sacrifice. And the whole time while all this is going on, and I'm waiting for the elder to come down and pass the crackers, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm replaying in my mind all the events that transpired in my life since the last time we had communion. And I'm thinking, okay, now, did I miss any sin? Okay, is there any sin? Oh my goodness, is there any sin that I forgot to confess? So I want to make sure I'm good. I want to make sure I'm worthy. Because if I'm not worthy, then I gotta let those crackers and that grape juice go by, right? Because we can't drink or eat, we can't do it in an unworthy manner, whatever that means. Then, okay, if I'm going to let the cup go by, if I'm going to let everything go by, then I'm thinking, okay, who's watching me? Now let's be honest with ourselves. All the whole time, we know we're supposed to have our heads bowed and eyes closed, but you always know somebody's watching you. Somebody's always noticing, is he going to take the crackers and juice? Oh, he didn't take the crackers and juice. What's going on with him?
Yeah.
What's he got going on in his life?
Then you got people who deliberately skip it because they want to draw attention to themselves.
So what do you got? You got this vicious cycle of introspection going on.
Oh, yeah.
Constantly.
Oh yeah.
I hated communion Sundays. I hated it because I always felt like I had to play this game over and over every time. This burden of going through all these mental gymnastics and emotional hoops.
Feel like?
And then, what happened? A couple weeks later, I'd come down with a bad cold or something, and I'm like, uh-oh, is God punishing me because I took communion and I wasn't worthy? I'm serious. I'm dead serious. This is the things that go through my mind.
You and everyone.
So now I have to pray and ask forgiveness for that. It ties you up in knots. It's not supposed to be that way, folks. It's not supposed to be that way. The institutional church has ritualized the Lord's table into some mystical experience just like everything else. And they use the Bible to support that tradition. And I maintain that the Lord's table was not this somber occasion of introspection, but it was a time of rejoicing and celebration. If our aim is to get at the truth, let's first make sure that we begin with the correct assumptions. And the way we do that is to take the time to set the historical context. Here we go again. I'm going to set historical context for you. Let's go back to the very first Lord's table. In fact, we have to go back even farther than that. We got to go all the way back to the book Exodus. And I wonder how many people in church know the real reason that Jesus met with his disciples in that upper room that night before he was crucified. We associate communion with the Lord's table. But I want to stress here that Jesus was not instituting a new ritualistic religious observance. Jesus was there with his disciples to celebrate Passover. I say celebrate Passover because that is exactly what Passover was. Passover was not a solemn occasion of introspection. Passover was a feast of celebration. It was the Jews' way of remembering and celebrating their freedom from slavery in Egypt. Yes, you had that whole death angel thing going on with the 10th plague, with the blood on the doorposts and everything else, but the real reason for celebrating Passover was to remember their flight from Egypt. This is also the reason why the streets of Jerusalem were overflowing with people the Sunday before Jesus' crucifixion. We call it Palm Sunday, when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. This was the preparation of the Passover. The city was full of people who were making the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, because Passover was one of those feasts where you were required, devout Jews were required to come to Jerusalem for the observance of Passover. And in each of the 4 Gospels, you see this reference to the Passover immediately before the account of the crucifixion. Matthew chapter 26. It says, "Ye know that after 2 days is the feast of the Passover, and the Son of Man is betrayed to be crucified." And then if you jump down to verse 17, "Now, look at this. The first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare thee to eat the Passover? And he said, Go into the city to such and such a man, and say unto him, The Master saith, My time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had appointed them, and they made ready the Passover. Mark chapter 14, verse 12. And the first day of unleavened bread, when they had killed the Passover, that would be the Passover lamb, the disciples said unto him, Where wilt thou that we go and prepare, that thou mayest eat the Passover? Luke chapter 22. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare the Passover, that we may eat. John chapter 13. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, and that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but all 4 Gospels give an account of the crucifixion, but the Gospel of John doesn't say anything about the Last Supper. You have verse 1 and 2 here in chapter 13 is the only mention of it, and he just glosses over it. he says, okay, they ate the Passover, and then after dinner, all these things happened. No detail about the passing of bread and the cup and everything else, or him giving Judas the bread dipped in the sop, okay? But the other four, John chooses to focus on a different aspect. He focuses on the things that Jesus taught them after dinner was over. You have chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16. You've got 4 chapters in the Gospel of John that occur after dinner is over. Jesus is giving last-minute instructions to his disciples. And then from there you go into chapter 17 and the Garden of Gethsemane, and then the soldiers come and arrest him, and we go from there. So, having said all that, aside from the Passover lamb, what was the other distinguishing part of the Passover? So, apart from the lamb and the blood on the doorposts, what else is associated with Passover?
Eating.
Pardon?
Eating.
Eating what?
The Seder meal.
Okay. And what do they have with the meal?
Bread.
What kind of bread?
Unleavened.
Unleavened bread. Okay. Unleavened bread and the Passover are associated with each other. Okay. Now, if you go back to Exodus, this is what we read. And this is the first institution of the Passover. This is right before the death angel came over. 7 days ye shall eat unleavened bread. Even the first day ye shall put away leaven out of your houses. For whosoever eateth leavened bread from the first day unto the 7th day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. That's Exodus chapter 12, verse 15. So, on day 1, before the feast of the Passover, they had to get all the leaven out of the house. Now, let's not dwell on this supposed symbolism of leaven. That's not my point here. It's not important to this discussion. My point is this. We seem to have this idea, and I know this was true with me growing up, that the only kind of bread that Jews ever ate was unleavened bread. That simply is not true. If that were the case, God would not have commanded them to get the leaven out of the house. They had leaven in the house. There's no point in saying get rid of the leaven if you're not using leaven in the first place. Why have leaven if you're not using it? What is leaven? Leaven is anything that's used to make baked goods rise. Okay? Today we use either yeast or baking soda or baking powder, depending on what kind of bakery baked item you're making. With yeast, yeast is a microbe that eats the sugar in the dough and it digests it and it produces carbon dioxide gas, and the gas bubbles create the gas creates these little air bubbles between all the strands of gluten in the flour, and then makes the dough rise and get all nice and big and fluffy. Okay? Baking soda and baking powder cause a similar effect in doughs by causing a chemical reaction to take place in the batter. And if any of you have ever baked a cake or cookies or anything like that, you know if you leave your batter sitting around too long before you bake it, your cookies or your cake's going to come out real flat because the chemical reaction has stopped happening in the batter. Now, in Old Testament times, and in some other countries, they actually still make bread this way. Families made enough bread to last for a whole week. They didn't bake bread every day. They went and when Nana would go and bake bread, she'd make bread for the whole week. And it was quite an ordeal. And they didn't use yeast like we use today. They would use a starter lump. And a starter lump would be a small amount of dough that already had the leavening in it. And it would grow, and they would store that in a clay jar. And then, when they were ready to make bread for the coming week, they had these huge wooden kneading troughs. I don't know if you can see about the size of this podium here. Imagine a trough, probably a little bit longer than this, probably about that deep. and about just as wide. They would add all the flour and the water and the salt and the sugar and the oil, and then they would go over, take their clay pot, take the starter lump out of the clay pot, throw that in, and knead that all together. And that's how they would leaven the whole lump. Because you just need a little leaven, leavens the whole lump, right? Okay? And then when they were done, you know, so they got all mixed together, then they divided it all up into their loaves, and then they reserve a portion of that. And they take that and they put that back in the clay jar, and that's their starter for the next week. And they make bread again. So when God told them to get rid of all the leaven in the house, what they had to do is get rid of all these jars of starter that they had stored in their house. So what exactly is unleavened bread like? Is this just regular bread without leaven in it? Kinda, not quite. There's actually a recipe for it found in, I think it's Leviticus. I'm sorry, I did not take the time to look this up, but I do remember coming across this in my Bible reading one time. I believe it's somewhere in Leviticus, but it's a very simple recipe. It's 3 parts finely milled flour to 1 part olive oil. Now, I remember thinking when I came across that, when I saw that very simple recipe, I thought to myself, you know, that's the exact same recipe for pie crust. Same ratio. When I make pie crust at home, or when my wife makes a pie crust, we use 1½ cups of flour and a stick of butter. And a stick of butter is equivalent to ½ cup of butter. So you got 3 half cups of flour and 1½ cup of butter, 3 to 1. You cut the butter into the flour, it's all mixed up, and you roll it out and you bake it, and that's exactly how they made their unleavened bread. They might not have rolled it out as thin as you would pie crust. They probably rolled it out to about maybe that big or so, maybe 12 inches or more, and it ended up being about that thick. And then they put it in a pan, in a frying pan, or some kind of pan, and either put it in their oven or just set it right on top of their fire and bake it right there and just kind of bake it right there in the pan. And what you end up with is this disc that's light and flaky, just like pie crust. Now, some people think of unleavened bread being like a pita or a tortilla. You know, pitas and tortillas are kind of soft and they're pliable and you can tear them and such. But that's not what unleavened bread is like. It's the same texture as pie crust. And in a minute I'll get into why that's significant. So this is the kind of bread they ate at the Passover meal. Now God told them that they were to eat this bread for 7 days. Now this would seem to suggest that it was a commandment of God. But in reality, it becomes more a matter of practicality than simply a command from God. In fact, as I read this, I don't see this so much of a command as God simply informing them of what they can expect to happen in the next week. Because what happens? The very next day after Passover, Pharaoh is so enraged over the death of his own son, he wants the Jews out of there yesterday. He can't get them out of Egypt fast enough. Remember? This is why God told Israel on the night of the Passover they were to have everything ready. They took their baths, they got dressed, they had their shoes on their feet, because they had to be ready to flee at a moment's notice. Because when Pharaoh's son dies, he says, get out of here now. He's not messing around. So they had to be ready to go. And since they put all the leaven out of the house, that means they didn't have time to make any bread after they left. All they had was this unleavened bread, right? They couldn't make a week's worth of leavened bread because God told them to get rid of all the leaven. So he says, so he made provision for them. He said, it's your custom to make a week's worth of bread. Well, you know what? For the next week, you're going to be running you're going to be running. You're going to be fleeing. So since I want you to get rid of all, you're still going to make bread to last you a week, but this bread's going to be unleavened bread because I want you to get rid of all the leaven. So along with the celebration of Passover, you have this feast of unleavened bread that is incorporated along with the Passover. And this is all part of this celebration, remembering when Israel was freed from Egypt and they ate unleavened bread for the next 6 days afterwards, 7 days total, because that's the only kind of bread they had to eat. Now fast forward 1,000 years or more, give or take. And we find Jesus in the upper room with his disciples, and he's passing around bread to them. Can I stress this anymore? This is not a new thing to these people. This is not something new. For one thing, even if Jesus and his disciples were meeting together in this upper room just to have a regular meal, they would have had bread anyway, because bread was part of their meal. So since this was the Passover meal, and they were commemorating Israel's flight from Egypt, the bread was unleavened with this meal. So this was, any time they had Passover, they ate bread for 7 days, unleavened bread for 7 days. This was not new to them. Now go back to what I said before about the pie crust. What happens when you put your fork through a pie crust? You have a nice big hunk apple pie sitting there on your plate, and you go to take your fork and you go to take a piece, bite apple pie, and you put your fork through it. What happens to the pie crust? It what?
Breaks.
It breaks. Right. It doesn't cut real nice and neat. It kind of crumbles apart, doesn't it? You can't tear it or cut it. You have to break it because of its texture. So when you hear this expression, breaking bread together, this is a reference to the breaking of the unleavened bread that was part of the Passover meal. Imagine this. You've got this disc of unleavened bread like pie crust. They pass it around. They can't tear it because it's not soft and pliable. It's flaky and crumbly like pie crust. So when they go to take a piece, it breaks. And I think there's a significance to this. Because as we saw in my last session, when the believers in the first century assemblies gathered together for fellowship, one of the functions of edifying each other, Acts chapter 2 mentions the breaking of bread. Could it be that this is a reference could it be that this reference is more than just about sharing a meal together? Could this be a reference to New Testament believers observing Passover and eating unleavened bread when they gathered for fellowship? Certainly in Acts 2 it is. When we're in Acts 2, we're at this point in the early history of the church, excuse me, of the assembly, where all believers are still Jews. It hasn't gone to the Gentiles yet. Notice that they never stopped being Jews. The ceremonial feasts had special significance to them, especially since they were disciples of Christ. They still went to the temple for various things. The temple was still central to their customs and their culture. They never stopped being Jews. Now fast forward once again to our opening text in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We're in Corinthians. Now we don't have Jews or just Jews. We have Gentiles thrown into the mix now. And quite possibly, you've got Gentiles with probably this mix of Hellenistic Jews in that region. All believers, Jews and Gentiles, all having fellowship together. And there is a strong implication that in this text that they are still observing Passover. Because Paul references the breaking of bread. We see no evidence of Jesus ever implementing any new ceremony or tradition. What he does do is he gives it a new significance, an additional significance. All he said at the Last Supper was, when you do this, remember me. Anytime you gather together for fellowship and you're eating a meal together, especially if you're observing Passover and you send around the unleavened bread and it breaks and crumbles, remember how my body was broken. When the meal's over and you're sharing a glass of grape juice with each other, think about my blood that was shed. He's adding this significance to the Passover meal. Jesus' point, okay, sorry, I just said that. All right, so, find my place where I'm on my notes here. Along with that last day, remember everything I taught you about, so going along with this remembrance of Jesus, remember I said in John chapter 4, there's 4 chapters worth of instructions that Jesus is giving. Okay, 4 whole chapters of instructions. So, not only remember my death, but remember everything I told you right the night before I died. 4 chapters worth, John records. So if we are to assume then that the believers in Corinth were in fact observing Passover, the believers in Corinth, if we are to assume that the believers in Corinth were observing Passover and eating unleavened bread for that reason, then what is the deal with Paul's rebuke to them? What is all this talk about being unworthy and damnation? And again, we need to start with correct assumptions. So let's try to figure out the context. Rather than starting at verse 23, like most churches do on Communion Sundays, rather than starting there, and you know, this is probably the only time you ever hear communion talked, the Last Supper talked about in church, is on Communion Sunday, right before you take communion. It's the only time you'll ever hear anything, any semblance of exegesis of a passage, whether it's right or even if it's erroneous. Really the only time it's ever mentioned. So in my attempt to establish context here, let us back up a few verses. Let's go up to verse 16. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 16. What is Paul saying to these Corinthian assemblies? But if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the assemblies of God. Now in this that I declare unto you, I praise you not, that ye come together not for the better, but for the worse. For first of all, when ye come together in the assembly, I hear that there be divisions among you, and I partly believe it. For there must be also heresies among you, that they which are approved may be made manifest among you. All right, let's take this apart, because there are several key verses in this key phrases in this passage that will give us clues as to what's going on, and I've emphasized those phrases here. Let's start with this word contentious. This word contentious is the Greek word philonikos. Philonikos. It's a compound word. You have the prefix philos, which means to be fond of or love for. You get words like Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. You have the philo in front of it. Philanthropy. Okay, love for mankind. The second part of the word is nikos. And nikos means to conquer or to rule over. So what you have here is one who is fond of ruling over others. One way of translating this word is rivalrous. Someone who is a rival. Can you picture this? This is not just two people bickering. Contentious is not just talking about two people bickering over something. You have basically two alpha dogs in the room trying to figure out which one's better than the other. Okay? One of them's they're trying to establish a pecking order. In other words. Okay? The suggestion here seems to be a class issue, where you have some who view themselves to be in a certain social strata. The idea of rivalry, or those who deem themselves better than others because of their social standing, this runs counter to the body of Christ. And that's Paul's point. Paul says that kind of thinking has no place in the assembly. We're not doing that here. We have no such custom. In fact, we can go back and remember what Jesus said in Matthew 20, verse 25. Jesus called unto them and said, Ye know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and that they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you. Now, he's instructing his disciples who are Jews, and he's telling them how Gentiles behave. Where are we now? We're in Corinth with a bunch of Gentiles, and look how they're behaving. They're trying to exercise dominion over each other. Okay? This is exactly what Jesus talked about. Paul says, I know you guys have this custom where you think that if you have a certain social status, that you think that gives you the right to rule over others and entitles you to certain privileges. And that's the other key word here, privilege. Okay, you do have situations where you have some who are merchants and some who would be considered the aristocracy in a society, and you have large numbers who are bondservants. The majority of the population in Roman culture were bondservants. So these people are bringing these social divisions into the assembly. Paul says, that's not going to fly here. That's not how we do things in the assembly. What does he call it? He calls it, what? Heresy. He says that's heresy. In fact, it also seems like they were teaching that as a practice. They were teaching that it's okay to have these social divisions whenever we gather together. Paul says, you know what? You brought in a heresy into your assembly. Now look at this. Now look at this next part. He goes on, because I want you to see. He says you want to create this hierarchy of importance. When ye come together, therefore, into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating everyone taketh before another his own supper, and one is hungry and another is drunken. He says you're not coming together to have a fellowship meal and observe Passover and take the Lord's table. He says you're coming to show each other where you belong in a social pecking order. To remind yourselves where you stand in the class, what class division you're in. You're not meeting for the right reason. Your motivations are wrong. You're not here to fellowship and celebrate Passover. You have the socialites, the merchants, the aristocrats getting to the assembly early, and because of their assumed social privilege, they don't think they have to wait around for the bondservants to get there. What is supposed to be a time of fellowship and mutual edification has turned into a drunken slosh fest. And then by the time the bondservants and the other latecomers get there, there's no food left. And they go hungry. And now Paul gets really nasty. He says, what? Have you not houses to eat and to drink in? If you're going to do this in your own house, in your own time. Or do you despise the assembly of God so much that you cause shame on them that have not? What shall I say unto you? Shall I praise you in this? Not. I think not. Here's the distinction. Those who have houses to eat in, those who don't. What do you have? Paul, what do you have? Social caste.
Right.
Right? Religious caste. Those who have not. They've made that distinction. The privileged, the elite, the rivalrous, those who are fond of ruling over others versus those who have not. The clear social distinction that they seek to bring into the assembly. Now consider what these home fellowships had turned into in Corinth, especially when it came to celebrating Passover and Paul's scathing rebuke of them. What was going on? And these next verses should make abundant more sense. Now we have come back to where we started. Now we get to the meat and potatoes, what you normally hear on Communion Sunday. This is really no different. It's really not that difficult to understand now. We've got the context. The rest of this should make abundant sense. Let's begin with verse 27. Okay, so I'm going to skip the first part, skip down to verse 27 now. This is the part that's normally the scary part. This is going to make a lot of sense now. Wherefore, whosoever shall eat this bread and drink this cup of the Lord unworthily shall be, what's the word?
Guilty.
Say it nice and loud.
Guilty.
Guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. Guilty is the key word. That's the scary word. Guilty. How much of Protestantism is focused around making believers, keeping believers guilty?
All of it.
All of it. There's this preoccupation with guilt. When we hear guilt, what is our immediate thought? What do we think of?
Damnation.
What?
Damnation.
Damnation. Condemnation. Okay? Protestantism has turned this into a condemnation passage. And since Protestantism has this focus on the law being the standard for righteousness, there remains this notion of still being under law, still being under condemnation. So, is it any wonder that any of us had this nagging anxiety in the pit of our stomachs every time we took communion? Wondering, am I guilty? Oh, am I guilty? Am I guilty? Am I still guilty? I'm still shaking my head at this. This word translated guilty is the Greek word inokos. Inokos. Do I have it up there? Yeah. Inokos. It's derived from a root word that means to hold in or to be liable for. Okay? To hold in or to be liable for. It carries with it some sense of responsibility. It has a legal usage. When we speak of liability, we're talking about legal responsibility, aren't we? Okay? What kind of, on your car, what kind of insurance are you required to have on your car? You don't necessarily have to have collision, but everybody, at least in the state of Ohio,
Liability.
is required. What, Susan?
Liability.
I'm sorry, Barb?
Liability.
Liability. What does that mean?
Responsibility.
It means you're legally responsible for that. If you do any damage with your car to somebody else's property, you are liable for that damage. Okay? But liability also has an accounting usage. You have a legal usage, but you also have an accounting usage. if you are an accountant, have any of you ever had any accounting experience? Yes? No? No? In a ledger, you normally have two columns. You have assets and liabilities, right? Assets are things that add value. So an asset might be your house, your car, cash. These are assets. These are things that add value to your net worth, okay? And normally when you want to calculate one's net worth, you add up the assets and then you subtract the liabilities, things that take away value, and that's how you end up with your net worth. And hopefully your assets are greater than your liabilities so that you are worth something. Many people, their liabilities are greater than their assets. But liabilities take away value. Okay, do you see what Paul is saying here? He's saying when you come together for fellowship and you start behaving this way, especially when it comes to the Lord's table, he says, listen, you are a liability. He's not saying you're guilty. He's saying you are a liability. Write that in the margin of your Bible. Wherefore, whosoever shall eat this bread and drink of this cup of the Lord unworthily shall be a liability of the Lord's body, of the body and blood of the Lord.
So in essence, it means that they are taking away from what the communion service is supposed to be all about.
Exactly. Exactly. You are devaluing it.
You're devaluing it.
You're taking away its value. Furthermore, verse 29, for he that eateth and drinketh unworthily, eateth and drinketh, oh, here's another scary word, damnation to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. For some reason, this word in the Bible is consistently translated damnation. You do a word study on this, and everywhere in the New Testament where you see this word damnation, it is this Greek word krima, right here, krima. And the Greek definition, it means judgment, as in a sentence. Okay. Now, what I say that is, you're in a trial and you've tried your case. Prosecution has presented their case. The defense has presented theirs. Then the judge renders a judgment, okay, or his sentence. I'm going to sentence you to 5 years in prison or whatever. 30 days community service, whatever it is. That's the word krima. It's the sentence, or the judgment or the sentence rendered. Notice it carries with it no religious connotation. It's a legal term, not a religious term. And it is also the root word in several other words that we are familiar with in the New Testament. From the word krima, we get the word krino. That's the actual legal proceedings itself. When you go to court and you're in the courtroom and you're presenting your case, that's krino, the actual legal proceedings. Or diakrino. That means discernment. Dia actually means through or over or through. So, or between. Judging between. When you're using discernment, you're making a judgment between two things. What's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong, what's error, what's truth. You're exercising discernment. That's diakrino. And here's that root word for judgment. Or katakrino. Katakrino. That means to judge against. Here's where we get this idea of condemnation. Okay? To judge against. you're in a court, if you're in a, if you have to go to court and you're a defendant in a trial, the judge renders a sentence against you. That's katakrino. Okay? A sentence that doesn't result in your favor. Condemnation. Now, you know what? All of these words appear in our passage. All of these words show up in our passage, and I'm going to show you where they are. Damnation damnation has a religious connotation and implies condemnation in hell, or Sheol, or ultimately the lake of fire. Okay? You see what happens when you talk about damnation in the context of this passage? When you tell people that if they take communion and they are somehow not worthy, that they are in danger of damning themselves to hell.
Oh, yeah.
Can you see how this is confusing? It's confusing because you're starting with the wrong assumptions. Now, without straying too far off track, let me put it in these terms. You have people thinking this way because Protestantism is religion that keeps people under condemnation on purpose. You tell people they need to live by faith alone. You tell them that Jesus keeps the law for them. You tell them that anytime they think they've done a good work, they've put their justification at risk. Now you've got this very same kind of perpetual introspection going on during communion, when they're supposed to be celebrating. And now they think, wow, if I'm unworthy to take communion, maybe I'm not really saved. Maybe I need to get right with the Lord. You know what? Next altar call, I'm going to go do that. Maybe I need, I don't want to take communion when I shouldn't and then end up being damned. Burns me up. Alright, end of rabbit trail. What is Paul saying? 3 words are in play here. Judgment, discernment, condemnation. Let me try to make sense of this. How does this look? Can you see all this okay? I tried to adjust the spacing on the lines, between the lines, so it's easier to read. Okay? Let's look at this passage one more time now, understanding these words, what they mean. For he that eateth and drinketh unworthily, eateth and drinketh not damnation, judgment to himself. He's going to be sentenced somehow. Not discerning, diakria, not judging between, not using good discernment, the Lord's body. For if we would judge, there's diakrino again. If we would use discernment, we would not be krino. We would not have to go through legal proceedings. No one would judge us. What does it say? Judge not, lest ye be judged. Use good discernment, lest it's necessary for someone else to judge you. But when ye are judged, krino, if it is necessary for someone to judge you, we are chastened. This is for the purpose of fatherly discipline, not condemnation. That we should not be condemned with the world. This is so simple, it's ridiculous. Okay? This is the difference between discipline, fatherly discipline, and condemnation. This is the difference between being under law and not under the law. The world is under the law. When they are judged, they're condemned. But when God judges us, it's for the purpose of fatherly discipline and not condemnation. Can this be any clearer? Paul is saying, you're not under condemnation with the world, but you are going to be under fatherly discipline. If this isn't simple already, let me make this as simple as I possibly can. Paul's saying, use good discernment. That's it. That's Paul's rebuke. You are not using good discernment. This drunken fest that you've turned the fellowship into is not using good discernment. And in the process, you have become a liability to the body of Christ. Do I need to go through all the verses about our conversation, our way of life, the way that we are to conduct ourselves in the world? Verses about controlling our bodies, verses about controlling ourselves, because this is part of our sanctification. Do you see the application here? Use good discernment so that you do not become a liability to the fellowship. He says your behavior is a liability. Another way we can say this, you're not being a good testimony.
And who do we want to judge us or to point out error in our life? Do we want a fellow brother or sister in Christ to do that? Or
Right.
do we want the unsaved to make that judgment? How embarrassing.
Right. And why do you think the unsaved judge us the way they do?
Because they see that.
Because they see this nonsense going on. Now, it might not be the Lord's table, but look at all the nonsense going on with sexual abuse and spiritual abuse in the church. Physical abuse. There, you have become a liability. That's another rabbit trail.
Andy, a few verses back, where was the one with the word dominion in there? You said,
you're talking about in Matthew chapter 20, where Jesus is talking about the Gentiles exercising dominion over each other. Yeah.
Right.
because this was a church in Corinth, a Gentile, mainly Gentile Christians, some Hellenistic Jews being converted, possibly, in this. The Gentiles, greatly influenced by the Greco-Roman culture and philosophy, it was all about greater than and lesser than. And
social
dominion,
status.
the social status, and having dominion in thought and deed for control. And this is where this is really cautioned. Are you acting this way to control other people? And in essence, they were, because they were controlling the service to keep their
perception of
elitism.
Yeah, elitism.
To keep that from, to keep that the top of the topic there, and not, and really denying the fellowship to those of the lower classes of people.
Right. Right.
So again, it's all about control.
Yep. And Paul says, it's this simple. Use good discernment so that you're not a liability to the fellowship. Peter said, judgment must begin where? At the house of God.
Household of God, actually.
Household, yep. This is what he means. Use good discernment. And there may come a point when discipline and correction is necessary so that you do not become a liability. Right? God disciplines us and chastens us like a father disciplines a child, an unruly child, so that child doesn't become a liability either to himself or to the rest of the family. This is why Paul said what he said in verse 30. This is the other scary verse. For this cause, many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. And we all know that sleep is a euphemism for what? Death. This isn't God striking you dead. Although we do have an example of that happening in the book of Acts with a couple by the name of Ananias and Sapphira. That was an instance of fatherly discipline for a couple that had become a liability to the body of Christ. And he dealt harshly with them because they were such a liability, especially so early on. Okay? But what he's talking about here is either fatherly chastisement, but what this is, more importantly, this is simply God allowing natural consequences of your behavior to take its toll. Think about it. If you have this drunken fest going on, and people are eating and drinking themselves to excess, think about the kind of toll that is going to have on the body. Sick, weak, drinking yourself to death. If you have others showing up late and there is not enough food for them, they're not going to get nourishment and stay healthy and robust. They're probably going to go hungry that day. And you think about how much disease and sickness was rampant in those times. You know, if you missed a meal and your body got weak because of it, how much more susceptible is your body to becoming ravaged by disease? Natural consequences to these actions. Okay? Paul's not saying lightning is going to fall from heaven and strike you dead. No. We know God doesn't work that way. You see the mystical aspect that the institutional church has placed upon this? Paul is saying there's natural consequences that are going to happen because of this behavior. This is why you've got people sick and weak and dying. Because you're destroying your bodies by doing this. It affects both groups of people here. It affects those who are eating and drinking to excess. It affects the ones who show up late through no fault of their own. It doesn't just affect the individuals using bad judgment. It affects the whole assembly. So what is Paul's solution? Just wait for everyone to get there, for crying out loud. Just wait for everyone to get there. Wherefore, my brethren, when ye come together to eat, just wait for each other. And if any man is hungry, let him eat at home. So that when you come together, it's not unto condemnation. No, sorry, cross that word out. That's not condemnation. It's the word krima, judgment. And the rest I will set in order when I come. It's not condemnation. Condemnation is for the unsaved. Condemnation is to do with sin and eternal damnation. It's not the word condemnation here. It's not katakrima. It's krima. Judgment. Discipline. Fatherly discipline. Self-discipline. He says, if you do this, if you use good discernment, judgment's not going to be necessary. The kind of judgment that results from using bad discernment. Now, how do we do communion at home with my family? One of these days, I probably should do a video of this. I've done a video of our one of our home, I did a video of one of our Bible study times at home one time, but we don't really do, you know, since we're not really into much of observing the Passover, you know, we don't do communion per se on a regular basis, but every once in a while we'll do it, but it will be we'll have a special meal on that day. We'll just have a big Sunday meal, something special like a big roast or something like that, and instead of baking rolls, I'll make a batch of unleavened bread, and then I'll put little cups around, we'll get some grape juice, and that we'll actually integrate that into our Sunday dinner. And then as we do it, we're going to say, okay kids, now why are we doing this? And that's the other thing. I don't know if my 8-year-old is saved or not. She's never made a profession of faith. My goodness, you're letting your 8-year-old who hasn't claimed to be a Christian and who hasn't been baptized, you're letting her take communion? She's taking it unworthily. No. When we were still going, the last year that we were going to the institutional church, I had all our kids take communion. I told them, go ahead, take it. Go ahead. What's it about? We're remembering, it's just remembering Jesus. So when we do it at home with our meal, I say, okay kids, why are we doing this now? Okay, because we understood this is what the Jews did for Passover. We understand why. Everything I just talked about, we go over with them. I said, okay, so enjoy it. And they love it. They love the unleavened bread. They keep asking, Dad, can we have unleavened bread this week? They want to do it. Because they like the difference of the bread. They look at it as a treat, but we bring it back and we say, okay, why are we doing this? I said, okay, yeah, that's right. We remember what Jesus did for us. Okay, good. Now enjoy it. That's it. That's what a family does. Right? Questions? Comments? I'll count to 10.
In my research that I was doing in the early church, many of the believers were participating in a lot of the Jewish celebrations and festivals and events. They had Jewish friends. They were participatory in those. And they would go to synagogue on Saturdays. They enjoyed that type of worship service. And then on Sunday they would go to Mass. Well, so many of the believers were attending the Jewish celebration of the Word and what they were learning in the synagogue, that attendance went down. And so a decree was passed by the bishop of that church that you have to decide whether you are a Jew or a Christian. Because if you want to be a Jew, then you be a Jew. And risk condemnation. Because of course, you know, Jews weren't saved, quote unquote. And so and then a few years later, the Pope made the decree that you could not associate with or worship or celebrate any festival or commemoration connected with the Jewish faith. And this is where a lot of the anti-Semitic behavior came, is that they had to decide that these people were unworthy and therefore not a part of the fellowship of believers. And were made to choose. And the thing was is that the people found more to learn and more life in the Jewish synagogue than in the institutional church. What's that say?
Yeah.
Right. They wanted the benefit of both. And they were also seeing it, these lay people were seeing it as a way to minister and witness to the Jewish community in their town, and that was taken away from them out of fear that they would be excommunicated.
Well, this whole dichotomy between Jew and Gentile, and even the verbiage, opportunity to minister to the Jewish community, the whole dichotomy is a crying shame, because the mystery of the gospel, one of the primary purposes of the gospel is to make Jew and Gentile one body, the one new man, as Ephesians calls it. And now, because of Protestantism, we got to get past all of this baggage that is the difference between Jew and Gentile and blah blah blah. And if you think about it, that Jewish Church of Messiah that we went to was a really completely inaccurate and erroneous in its approach, because it made a distinction. So we're because of these traditions in Protestantism, we're in the arrears big time. We've got a lot of work, hard work. To do.
And Susan, you mentioned that how they were learning more at the Jewish synagogues. They were learning more. They were growing more by just hearing the teaching from the Jewish synagogues. Right. It is for that very reason that kind of echoes my own personal philosophy when I'm doing research, especially if I'm doing historical research for a topic like this or whatever, and I'm Googling stuff, the first thing always comes up: Bible Gateway, Bible Hub, something's, it's always these, you get this laundry list of Christian sources. And somebody on the blog asked me directly one time, he said, what commentaries do you use, or what kind of commentaries do you use? And I told him, I said, I don't use commentaries. I said, in fact, I avoid Protestant Christian, quote-unquote, Christian sources like the plague. I said, I will either choose a secular source, and short of a secular source, I will use a Jewish source. Because the Jewish sources are going to have an insight into their customs and traditions that we don't have.
The 4 books, I'll have to bring them out and show you, that I started with in my research. Because when I wanted to do what was ancient life like, I totally avoided any Christian information books at all. And I purchased 4 books, all by secular authors. And what was so precious about every one of them, one was gravely more socialistic. That was the nature of the man. But the other authors constantly repeated that the only text that we start with as these socio-archaeologists is the Bible. This is the only text that we can go to get information from, to study what ancient life was like. And then we kind of piece together some other stuff here from the actual digs and other documents that we find from the cultures around them. But those books were the ones that, you want to use the phrase, blessed me the most, because I could see through more accurate, less mystical eyes. Always these other places I went to online, always looking for this allegory, this narrative behind all of this stuff. I wanted the facts, the Hebrew verite, as close to the Hebrew truth that you could get in that. And that's where I learned the most. It wasn't until 3 months ago that I actually started cross-referencing what I had learned with Christian texts, just out of curiosity. And the one gentleman that I found the most helpful, he's kind of like a Messianic Jew, in that he believes in going back to your Hebrew roots, and this is, he really immerses himself in the Hebrew language to try to find the best meaning of Old Testament scriptures that he can get. And otherwise, I have stacks of stuff that I have downloaded offline that I go through and read it when I need to chuckle and laugh. Because it's so sad, the condition we've allowed ourselves to get into as far as learning the truth of God's Word.
All right. Great. Any other comments from anyone? Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody.